good times are good for everybody, right? Bad times and how you handle them are really important. If there is an unescapable problem within your company and within your past performance, sometimes it's best to own it. There's a fun clause in every RFP almost that says, the government reserves the right to look at any information that it has, not just what you give us. So if there's a problem, I'm not saying put it in flashing lights, but acknowledge it and explain how you handled it. Because customers are interested in knowing innovative problem solving when things go wrong as much as they are high performance when things go right.
Welcome to the Optimize podcast, brought to you by VisibleThread. The Optimize podcast is your go-to source for expert insights on BD, capture, proposal management, and government contracting. Each series is hosted by an expert in the field, bringing their unique experience and strategies to every episode. We're excited to have Marcia Watson as our host for this series. Marcia is a proposals operations expert who has led teams to grow contract wins from $600 million to over $2 billion. With years of experience, Marcia and her guests are here to help you navigate the complexities of all things GovCon. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on wherever you are listening. Now let's join Marcia on this episode.
Welcome to VisibleThread's Optimize podcast, Strategic Edge, Navigating Competitive Intelligence in Capture. In this episode, we delve into the strategic world of competitive analysis and intelligence within the capture and proposal process. Understanding and leveraging competitive intelligence has become more crucial than ever. Join us as we uncover the tactical approaches that can transform competitive intelligence into a powerful tool for success. I'm Marcia Watson, CEO of BTW & Company. Joining me today is Steve Skeldon, Capture Director at Chickasaw Nation Industries. Steve is an experienced capture and proposal professional with over 14 years of experience in the federal market. He made the jump from proposal development to capture management in 2021. Steve is a member of the International Board of Directors for APMP and formerly served as Vice President and Conference Chair of the APMP NCA chapter and was named APMP 40 Under 40 in 2018. Steve, I'm so happy to have you here with me today. How are you doing?
Great. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's important stuff.
Totally. Absolutely. So, Steve, we've known each other for a long time. Both of us started careers at one of the bigs, and then we kind of found our way up the ladder, and now we're the thought leaders that we are today. Your experiences at APMP are inspiring, and your activity across this industry is remarkable. But really what we understand is that demonstrated early mentorship and guidance is a solid foundation for growth. I know you and I both appreciate our roots, and we're so excited to have grown to who we are today.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, Steve, in competition, the winning bid should be verifiably better than the competition's. And in these days of protest, that intel should be rock solid and incontrovertible. So I don't think that it's a coincidence that we shifted our professional focus towards capture and solutioning. We spent way too long looking backwards, meaning that you and I, Steve, know how to produce a better proposal when pre-RFP activities align to what we need to say to strengthen the competitive value of the bid. So with that, let's just get into it. Why do you think companies tend to just under-focus on competitive analysis?
So I think a lot of the time companies tend to under-focus on competitive analysis because they're doing what they call in the industry drinking their own bathwater. There's a lot of, we're the best at this. Nobody does this like we do. And that may be true if you're a brand name, in the services market, like a McKinsey, there's or a Deloitte, there's a lot that they have proprietary that other companies can't do. But for the vast majority of specifically services contractors, it's pretty replaceable. There's not a lot that your company does, that my company does, that is not replicable by other companies. Management approach is one place that you can design innovations, but it's difficult because there's only so many different ways to manage a contract. Technical approach is another, where companies can really shine in their solution development is trying to find a way to make it more efficient, save the government time, money, or increase quality, right? Those are the big three triangle. but people tend to think, oh, they get in their heads and they think, oh, we're the only ones that can do this. We don't need to worry about the competition. This customer loves us. There's no need to worry about it. And you end up getting bitten. You end up getting bitten on price. You end up getting bitten by another innovative approach. There's a lot of ways that you end up getting bitten when you don't focus on the competition.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's consequences to that as well. I mean, we all hear about the terms ghosting and competition, but really it's a matter of being able to demonstrate your company's own strengths in their value proposition and to be able to use validation to justify those strengths. But it's even better if you can use a comparison to justify those strengths from a competitive analysis. So knowing that brings such value, why is it that companies might not put the right resources into competitive analysis as a best practice inside the organization?
It's expensive. The amount of time that it takes to understand your market is not small. There is a habit in the industry that I've seen at multiple companies to chase things that just came out because, oh, this is right in our sweet spot. This customer asks us to bid, and there's a number of reasons the customer is going to ask you to bid, and oftentimes it's to drive competition because that's their job. So understanding the messenger on when you get asked to bid something is critical, and it's not always because they want you. Sometimes it's because they need to have 2 or 3 bidders. So that's the time constraint around that is what makes people not focus on competitive analysis. It's hard, right? There's only so many things that you can do to learn about your competition. A lot of what we do is public as federal contractors, but a lot of what we do is not public. CPARs are not public. How well you do the job is not public. You have to be able to get insight from conversations with customer, conversations with people on the program, on adjacent programs. There's a number of different ways to do it, but none of them are quick. There's no easy button for competitive analysis, although I wish there was, because that would make my job a lot easier.
I'm sure some of the AI companies think there probably could be one. Darn, I did not make it far enough without mentioning AI.
Any system is only good as the data that goes into it. So
True. Well, let's talk about that. So we're going to bounce around on the topic a little bit, Steve, following your lead. What tools are available for conducting competitive analysis?
So there's a lot of open source tools out there that are provided by the federal government, by your tax dollars. There's FPDS, which is the Federal Procurement Data System that catalogs every contract action that is taken in the federal government. Those are publicly accessible. It's not an ideal system. It's not particularly easy to navigate, but it is doable once you get the hang of it. I don't know why I didn't think of this before. I've always searched for like contract numbers and customer and contracts and customers to try and find something. But I had one of my BD guys the other day searching on keyword. And I was like, oh, I don't know why I didn't think about that. But you can, there's number of different ways that you can do it. It's kind of a 1-bar search for everything in government contracting as far as official contracting actions. Again, it will tell you the details around it, around period of performance, around obligations, around competition type. So you can look at a contract and see, is it full source? Was it sole source? Was it competitive? How many offers? And then there's USA spending, which can give you a little bit more insight on contracts that are, where the funding lines come from, who's obligated, things like that. And that can help you track the money back to where it goes. And that can help you understand where your customer is spending their dollars, whether it's with other. So I work for an 8A, tribal 8A, which is kind of a unique animal in the industry. And what you can do there is you can try and track down what different customers are spending on their 8A dollars through USA spending. And then there's kind of aggregators like a GovWin or a HireGov or a Govini. And my company uses GovWin, and it scrapes all the systems and pulls in all the data, as well as finding customer briefs. What's the word I'm looking for? The procurement forecasts, things like that. And then there's SAM.gov, which is the system of record for all non-task order specific contracts in the government. Although that doesn't stop government agencies from not using it. It just is officially what they're supposed to use. There are some agencies that use it exclusively. Army Contracting Command, if you go to their procurement forecast website, will tell you to just go to SAM, and it gives you handily some keywords to search to look for their procurement forecasts. So that's a good way to track down what's coming or where it's coming. But from a competitive analysis perspective, you can also search for companies and look up their SAM records, and you can get an understanding of how big they are, especially in the small business market, because they have to represent what their small business size standard is under certain NAICS codes, North American Industry Classification System. So using that, you may not be able to tell exactly what their annual or what their 5-year revenue is, but you can tell if they're representing small under 16, 32, 45, whatever the size standard is. And that can help you understand who is competing, if not what they can bring to the table.
Yeah, and I think even understanding who is competing is pretty critical. In our consulting firm and when we work with our clients, it's a matter of, do you maybe know how many competitors there might be in the market is the first question to answer, and a lot of times the answer is, well, it's a vehicle. The competitors are the other awardees on the vehicle. Well, no, you can really get down deeper into that, but it is kind of that funneled approach to getting to the degree of detail that the opportunity warrants, what your resources can afford or be delegated to get into in the time frame that you have. There's a lot of external influencers on how evolved that competitive intelligence can get. But I want to tie those strings together of the tools that you just talked about. So for example, you can get into FPDS and you can identify from that contract how many mods it's had, which kind of gives you that, did they underbid to begin with and do they need to push that up? Or are they being de-obbed? So you can get the public information on the contract value, but you don't actually understand how the money is being spent without getting into FPDS, for example, to see that. And so that gets you a lead. So then you take that information over to GovWin, GovTribe, whatever your commercially available tool is, and you can get into the next degree of detail, as you talked about, how many bidders were on the previous solicitation. You can also get into, of the incumbent, who are their subcontractors. So you can start to see not only is that a competition, but again, if you can get into the detail of that company relationship with their subcontractors, you might have other competitors out of that subcontractor pool. And it really is taking a degree of available information and then deductive reasoning, right, into what do I actually need to know? What can I glean and assume? And then, of course, any assumption needs to be validated with continued research. So putting all that in a nice little box and a beautiful bow would be delightful, but we're not always able to get to those great degrees of detail. So taking it back to the broad, and then we'll come back down to the narrow. Why is it that companies think that, the competition is who's on the vehicle? Why do they think they don't need to go any further than that? And as you kind of talked about, it's resources, it's expensive, but I feel like there's a philosophical mindset that I think we need to break down.
Humans are inherently lazy. They have a list of, and I am no exception to that. They have a list of contractors. I'll give you an example. The Oasis 8A Pool 1 has, I think, 98 contractors on it. It ends in about a month. So this is not going to be helpful past the middle of December. But we were chasing a large DoD opportunity. We knew it was coming out on Oasis 8A Pool 1, and we could have stopped there. We could have said, okay, it could be any one of these 98. But we knew that it was an 8A set-aside. And even though everyone on the vehicle, it was 8A when the opportunity released, that doesn't mean that they are now, right? The 8A program was 9 years, is now 10 years. So once you're in, there's an expiration date, and a lot of those people would get in at their last couple of years and be grandfathered in. There was a recertification on the vehicle halfway through the 10-year period of performance. So some of them dropped off then, others didn't. But what we did on that one was we asked the government to require recertification at time of proposal. And so the idea there was to drop the competition down, right? So to go from 98 to, it dropped it to 30 something. So cutting out 2/3 of the competition right there. And then additionally, there was a size standard of, 23 million on that particular one, somewhere in that ballpark. So we were able to scrape using SAM. And this is really, it's all about combining your resources, right? It's combining SAM, it's combining FPDS data. It's combining GovWin data. Combining our strategy team uses BGov for a lot of data analysis because there's a powerful data output tool there. And using that, we were able to see who was small under that NAICS code, whatever it was, 541 something, 330 maybe 519. But we were able to drop it down. And I think by the time we got to the release, the government had indicated that they would require an 8A recertification, and they had indicated that they may require a size standard recertification, which is not always something that you're going to get on a task order bid. But we had narrowed the pool of competitors down to like 14. And of those 14, we knew who had work within the agency, and we knew who was a likely bidder. And they were, I think it was maybe 7 or 8 of us. So from 98 to 7 or 8 was where we drew our focus on gathering that. We also focused on an unknown dark horse, right? Because we're not going to catch them all. It's not Pokemon. So we were trying to, from a price to win perspective, understand who might come in that we weren't seeing and get lower than us. Although this was very much a solutions-based bid. That particular one ended up being a no bid due to a number of factors, including some last-minute government requirements that came in. But I'm pretty proud of the competitive analysis that went into it. Talking to people in the industry, talking to people at the customer, getting an understanding of those 7 or 8, who they liked, who they had issues with. So once you narrow that list down, it becomes much more of a manageable scenario. I mean, what's the old saying? You know, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. Eating a 98 company elephant is a big task, but nobody has time to research to the level that you need to 98 companies. But you can research 7 or 8 fairly easily, right? That takes a lot less time and a lot less resources.
Absolutely. Congratulations on that degree of shaping. Whether it ended up in a no bid is kind of irrelevant, because I'm sure there are 6 other companies that would love to shake your hand right now for helping them. But that's impressive. That is something that is very, very difficult to do, especially on a vehicle, getting size standard recertifications, but you have to know what you're up against in order to know whether or not that's an appropriate tactic. It could certainly backfire if you're not paying attention to yourself. And especially in the terms of a tribal 8A, you've got long-term implications of making those sorts of changes on vehicles and such. So, there's strategy all over the place, short-term and long-term. So let's segue into that long-term a little bit. When you're collecting that intelligence, how are you storing it so that it's reusable in the future, that it's revisitable, revisable, as opposed to redone every time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be honest, we are working on building that. I just had a goals meeting with my boss yesterday, and that's one of our goals for this year, is to really kind of amp up our competitive knowledge database so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So what we're planning on doing is using our CRM to do that, to store data points about various competitors. I'd like to bring in more of an automated solution, not an AI solution, but like scraping FPDS and SAM to understand competitor landscapes from a work perspective and from a size perspective, because it matters a lot more. And if you're at a large, it matters a little bit differently. There are only depending on the size of the program and depending on the work, there are only so many competitors that are going to go after some things. If you're PDIT or Lockheed and you're chasing a $800 million task order for the Air Force, right? There's only a few contractors that are going to go after it. And the upside of being a large and the downside of being a large is that a lot more of your business is out there. So it's much easier to do research on a GD than it is on a company incorporated, right? Like there's I don't know the exact number, but I think it's in the hundreds of thousands of registered small businesses out there. And it's insane, but they're not all in your market. And so that's where you can use things like GovWin or Govini, or what was the other one you mentioned? GovTribe.
GovTribe.
To search on their competitive databases to understand, like, where do these people work? Like, where are most of their contract awards? Understanding NAICS codes has been kind of a superpower and really a huge tool for me in competitive research, because I don't care if they're doing something in janitorial work if I'm chasing an IT contract. So I can easily scrape out people who aren't in my market just by narrowing it down to the 5415 series of NAICS codes, because that's your IT services work. So understanding how NAICS codes work, each number has a meaning, and understanding kind of how that all comes together is really critical.
Absolutely. It's in the small business market, but it's more critical, as you talked about, in those IT NAICS, because there's a large dollar value NAICS codes. And so a small might not be so small that they don't have the appropriate resources to be able to compete in that field. That's hefty competition in small business in those larger dollar value NAICS codes. Knowing who's there, knowing who's on the cusp of outsizing that NAICS code, and paying attention to that landscape. Companies are getting bought and sold all the time as well. Like, you have to know who's looking out for who. Your competitor might be bought into a larger organization. So M&A really does come into a lot of that competitive analysis when you're looking at those smalls. Also, when you're looking at those larges, when they're not fully integrated yet and they haven't actually combined their companies to get to that affiliated state, that's a hefty competitor right there. And same with the tribal organizations that we're familiar with. They're backed by a lot of corporate resource that you can't take them for granted in that market. So even in that small business market, there are so many nuances to what classification, qualification, degree of maturity those businesses might have, and understanding where your company sits in that rank as well.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, we've got, I think our current number is like 17 or 18 LLCs. Some of them are, older and outside the 8A window, and they've been 8A, and we call them mature, or when they get old enough, they get sunsetted. And then we've got growth, which are kind of mid-cycle. And then we've got, what's the new one? New, I guess, is a way to put it. And so we've got companies that have the resourcing and backing of a $500 million a year business that are able to compete under the $12 million size standard. So it's really a force multiplier from our side. And I remember when I was in with larges and other smalls that I didn't love competing against tribals, because they could really kind of turn on the gas and get very deep in ways that we couldn't, and bring past performance in from other of their sister companies that we just didn't have the capability to do so. You mentioned sizing out. That's another thing you can do, is you can look at, recent awards in the last 3 to 5 years and get a sense of if they're getting ready to size out of a size standard, because I believe, and Marcia, correct me if I'm wrong, the size standard determination is based on a 5-year average. So if you have a company that won $700 million task order last year, they may not be sized out, but in 3 years they might be, because they're going to be burning, if it's a $500 million task order, assuming a 5-year period of performance, they'll be burning $100 million a year over the next 5 years. And that's only going to tick their average up over the next 5 years. So getting a sense from a long-term perspective on where your competitors are and where they may go is really critical. And we have teaming partners that will intentionally not bid on large opportunities because they don't want to size out and lose a competitive edge.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's another consideration for those small businesses.
Yeah.
So getting back into, how are we using that as competitive intelligence? That is a long-term perspective to hold on to. Again, why that research and your archive is what's important to be able to reflect back on those studies and that data that you've collected. But looking at the timeline, so we've talked about, not much can be done once that RFP drops in terms of competitive intelligence. So you just talked about, look, I can start looking 3 years ahead of who's going to be sized out. But where do you find, Steve, in the work that you do, without giving away Steve Skeldon's secrets to capture management, but looking at that timeline, where do you find is maybe that ideal lead time to start looking at competitive intelligence? And then how do you break that down during that life cycle to make sure it gets revisited occasionally and continues to be a driver in that capture practice?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the first thing that you'll do, and everybody's familiar with the business development lifecycle, so I won't get deep into that. But after you've qualified the opportunity, you get a sense of, and from a timeline perspective, the question was when, and the answer is 9 to 18 months out is when I like to start getting engaged in a capture. Larger ones further out, but there's limited ability to impact change too far out because you can, the requirements change so rapidly. The opportunity that I was talking about before, in the 16 or 17 months that I was tracking it and working on it, it probably changed, I don't know, like 15 times. Customer personnel came and left. The size dropped from it went from 5 to 800 to 400 million. So it really bounced around, and there was a lot of political aspect to that as far as internal customer politics and then politics around, we've just undergone a major election in this country. So there's a lot that's going to change in how acquisitions are managed that way. So just being aware of what's coming up and trying to get ahead of it as much as possible. But there's definitely a point of diminishing returns the further out you get. Like if you're 3 years out, you can have a sense of the market. But as far as a particular opportunity goes, you may not have the ability to know fully what's going to happen in the next 3 years from when it comes out. Like, you'll hear people say, oh, you should start your capture the day it's awarded. Sure, to an extent, right? But I'm not going to put full time and focus for 5 years on an opportunity that was awarded yesterday. Because it's so much is going to change in the next 5 years that it's just not necessarily worth the time and effort. And there are other it's opportunity cost at that point. There's other things that I could be spending my time on that are nearer term in the next 9 to 18 months that could benefit more from my time and my expertise than things that are 5 years out. Keep a finger on the pulse, but that shouldn't be your full-time focus until it gets a little nearer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then so when it does get nearer, that's when you can start to see who's going to fall off, who might have, been acquired or outsized and all of those things. So then when you're really getting into that 9 months out, 6 months out, 3 months out, and you're starting to collect actionable information on your opportunity, on your competitive analysis. Let's get into kind of what details and data can we collect from what goes into the proposal, right? So let's start again, big to small, because I kind of like funneling things. It's part of the job. Let's start technical. How, especially in a services, in a tool or supply or product, you've got solid things that you can compare to. I can compare my widget to your widget and know which works better, or at least think I know which works better. But in a services environment, from a technical perspective, maybe we'll touch upon the other topic next, but how do you really get into competitive analysis and competitive intelligence to a services type technical approach?
So there's a number of different ways you can back things out of total contract value. You can make some assumptions around average wrap rates and get a sense of, you can back into it using what you know about the market and what particular, and I'm talking specifically pricing right now. You can get into how did they solution this? Well, we think that they would need XYZ from a technical perspective. What did those people cost? You can kind of build up that solution on your side, and that's price to win. At the end of the day, it's figuring out kind of what it's not really price to win per se. I'm sure that some of the consultancies out there from a price to win perspective would reach through the microphone and string me right now. But what you can do
so what I kind of start dubbing it as price to execute. How much is it costing them to perform that contract?
Yeah. So you can kind of get a sense of what you can make a ballpark guess on what their fee is. You can make a ballpark guess on what their wrap rate is. I can tell you that a notorious low cost provider will have a much lower wrap rate based on their business model than a large systems integrator with a lot of facilities, a lot of overhead costs, highly paid executives. So that's all going to go in. So you can really kind of guesstimate their wrap rate based on that. And after you've got that, and you've got what you assume is their direct labor rate, then you can kind of back into how that's all put together. And that gives you a sense on what their technical perspective is and what their technical approach is. And it's as much math is involved, which hurts my brain. There is a lot. It's much. I think it's much more of an art than a science on that front.
It is. And I personally love that I said, how do you get technical strategy? And you went to pricing, because how many times is pricing the last thing we start looking at? In a services environment, your price will drive your technical approach and not the other way around. So I'm so thrilled, Steve, that you made that correlation without the drive to the question, because in a services environment, that is the way you go about it. That is the information that you need. Obviously, we can get into the key personnel and what their roles and responsibilities are, relationship with the client, but technical response in a services environment is highly driven by price. So having the opportunity to draw backwards again, bring in maybe a price to win expert to help do some of those calculations that those of us who are on the word side of the industry don't appreciate. Well, we absolutely appreciate, we don't want to do. And then use that to get further competitive intelligence out of these companies that you're evaluating against. You'll be able to see, from a technical perspective, what's their turnover rate if you're looking at, Glassdoor or, Indeed, and seeing, how many vacancies they're posting for these positions if it's an incumbent capture. So let's pull on technical a little bit more if we can switch over to some of the products and services, or products and supply. I know that's not exactly your area of expertise, but again, deductive reasoning, how do we go from what we do know into what we should know or could know in changing industries in that way?
Sure. So from a product side, and you're correct, this is not my area of expertise, but I'm happy to BS on it. I think educated guess flags. From a product side, I mean, let's take software, because that's probably as close to what I know as we can get here. There's different licensing models. So getting an understanding of what the licensing model for a software product is, you don't buy a product anymore, right? You don't buy Microsoft Word. You buy a license to Microsoft Word and you renew it every year. So understanding what their licensing model is can give you a sense of how much that might cost. And you can use that to kind of back into it. So you've got a, for sake of argument, for sake of math, a $10 million 10-month contract, and the incumbent has, if it's $10 million, 10 months, so that's $1 million a month. So what of that $1 million, what does that cost? The cost is not $1 million in software a month, because then you've got to add on the warranty service and the implementation. So you can make educated guesses on how much of that $1 million a month is services versus the product itself. And you can kind of back into that. And you can do that via market intelligence. You can understand similar products. You can, I don't, this is an ethical gray area, but you can schedule a demo and get pricing that way, but they're not going to give you the same pricing they're going to give the government. So with a grain of salt and with an ethical eye on that, because you want to be cautious about what you're doing and how you're representing yourself in a situation like that. And that's another key piece of competitive intelligence, is the ethics side of it, right? Could I call the company and pretend to be the customer and say, hey, how much would this cost? Sure. But is that ethical? Is that right? No, not at all. So you need to be above board. I try and use open source information as much as I can. You'll be shocked at what people will put online. What the government will put online. We competed on a contract. We did not win it. The government released the the award notice with an unredacted copy of the awarded contract, including CLIM structure.
Ooh,
and
wow.
I downloaded that immediately and I stuck it in a folder so they couldn't take it off SAM, because once it's out, right? It's the internet.
Right.
So I was able to back out exactly how we lost. And it was, we had proposed a different labor solution than what they had suggested in the contract and the PWS and the RFP. And the winning bidder to a T had gone and put the exact labor solution that the customer had suggested. And they did not do particularly well. I'm not saying we would have done better, but that's how they won it by as much as they did, because they were they went low price, basically technically acceptable on that one. But it was interesting. And all I had to do was just like look at the award notice. But you can Google things, and using Google in an effective way is really critical. Learning how to use advanced search and tags like file type PDF is pretty critical, because you can find specifically what you're looking for. When I'm looking for customer documentation, specifically DoD documents, DoD policies, they're not always the first result. But if I put in, I think it's file type PDF, only PDF results will show up. And so it's much easier to search down that. And you can do the same thing. Companies will put out way more information than they probably need to out there. If they're a publicly traded company, you can look at their 10K. You can get an understanding of what their filings are. People will brag a lot in press releases and tell you what they're doing and tell you, oh, we have this really innovative solution. Thanks. I appreciate that piece of information. Right? I'm going to file that one away.
Can you also post the schematics?
Yeah. Right? Yeah. So just don't be afraid to look for what you think. Don't assume it's not there, because it might be.
Exactly. And that's again, where the time factor comes in, because you don't know what you can actually find until you start searching, and then the rabbit holes just present themselves. I love getting into a good GovWin rabbit hole. I can click my way into the center of the earth. I don't know how to get back, but it drives you, especially a curious individual, which is the appropriate person to be in a capture role, is because it's exactly, how much more can I learn? How much more can I know? And then what do I do with that information? We'll get to that next. I want to pull these strings a little bit longer. So we talked about pricing. We talked about kind of drawing conclusions into technical solutions. We've discussed a little bit past performance. Past performance comes with the territory, that degree of assessment of that competitive analysis. You can see, again, the mods that they're getting. You can see, obviously, if they don't get their option years extended, those sorts of things, to kind of glean perspective on performance. But let's then talk about, how do we get those facts caught into our own corporate discriminators, and how do we use that information that we've collected in drawing out what that means for us and our company?
Yeah. So here's a good one. This isn't necessarily something that we've done, but it's something that I would absolutely do if I saw this. If you see a contract awarded on April 3rd and on April 6th, April 30th, you see mods, and their mods around adding funding or already extending period performance, their transition has not gone well. So what you can do then is say, in your technical approach, here's how we execute transition, seamlessly. We have the ability to do X, Y, Z. Here's our income capture rate. Here's what we do to mitigate risk and mitigate schedule risk. And we can turn this 100-person contract on in 3 days, right? Whatever. That's unrealistic, but you get the point that I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, alternatively, even without, the benefit of incumbency can be leveraged as well, right? So if you're the incumbent and for whatever reason the customer decides to put it out on a vehicle that you don't have access to, you can still find somebody that has that vehicle, team with them, and bring the workforce. So you can say, in that company's proposal, your prime, the prime can then say, we have the lowest risk transition because we have the incumbent on our team, right? We have the ability to turn this on day one. The risk of low performance is almost nothing because everyone is badged, everyone is in the system, everyone is doing the work today. So you really drive a transition risk down a lot, and especially in some of your higher mission importance places within the DoD and within federal health, that's critical because there can't be a lapse, right? There can't be a lag in service. I mean, if you're doing acquisition support for the Forest Service, it's probably a different story. But if you're doing, mission support work for Army Cyber, then they really can't have an off day, because that means that, China or Russia wins, and that's a problem.
So, we hate it when that happens.
Yeah, we don't have that.
Well, and again, along those lines, it's being able to know without a doubt that your company is the best company. And I will tell you, anytime a business developer ever said to me, this is ours to win, and then I said, who is your competition? And they can't answer, it's yours to lose.
Yeah.
Because somebody else knows that you are their competition.
Yeah.
And that's the other side of it. How do you use what you know other people know about you? This is the whole SWOT analysis, right? Maximize your strengths.
Right. Mitigate your weaknesses. Yeah.
So how do you use competitive in that assessment to kind of look back inwards of your organization?
So you can use competitive analysis on yourself, really. And in politics, they call it oppo for short. But it's research. And I'm completely spacing on what that means. But it's research on yourself from the opponent's perspective. And you can absolutely turn that around and do that to yourself. So if I said, what do I do wrong? And I've been toying with the ideas of things like premortems. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's essentially put yourself the day after the award is announced. Why did we lose? Right?
Yes.
And you
Great
can sit there and
tactic.
you can say, well, we lost because our price was too high. Okay, so how do we fix that? We lost because our technical was too aggressive. Okay, so where do we beef up to make sure the customer is comfortable with the approach? Or alternatively, we don't beef up. How do we communicate with the customer now to make them comfortable with this approach, right? How do we say, yeah, we don't need 3 risk management people, we only need 1 because XYZ. And then you don't just write it in your proposal. You go to the customer and you have that conversation. You say, hey, look, I know that your draft PWS says that you think that there need to be 3 of these people, but realistically in our experience with this customer, that job can be done by 1, and here's why. So that kind of ghosting yourself almost is important. And if there is an unescapable problem within your company and within your past performance, sometimes it's best to own it, right? You look at it from a parental perspective. I'd much rather my kid just came to me and said, hey, look, Dad, I screwed up, than trying to hide it, because they're going to find out, right?
Mm-hmm. They will. There's a
fun clause in every RFP almost that says, the government reserves the right to look at any information that it has, not just what you give us. So if there's a problem, I'm not saying put it in flashing lights, but acknowledge it and explain how you handled it. Because customers are interested in knowing innovative problem solving when things go wrong as much as they are high performance when things go right. Good times are good for everybody, right? Bad times and how you handle them are really important to demonstrate. And that can eliminate a ghosting opportunity on your competitor side, because they may know about it. And if you've upfront said it, hey, look, we screwed up and here's how we handled it. We worked with the customer, everything got back on schedule within 6 weeks, and everything is good now. And we've been successfully performing now for the last 3 years. After that one hiccup that was caused by XYZ, I don't know, our program manager got hit by a car and it was terrible, but we solved it.
right.
Things like that.
Hopefully we have a better example in the real world. But it's true, Steve. It's true. I mean, and we were taught early on in past performance, when they say, please state any issues that were identified on the contract, and the company is so hell-bent on saying nothing went wrong.
Nothing went wrong.
We performed perfectly. Yeah. That's not true.
It's not real.
It makes no sense. So yeah, we had a staffing issue, right? I mean, during COVID, there's nothing that couldn't have gone wrong. And luckily we're kind of hitting the end of where COVID becomes, era is past performance. Gosh, has it been that long? But to say nothing went wrong, absolutely untrue. So admit it. What went wrong? How did you resolve it? How did you put it into best practice, lesson learned, quality control plan to make sure it doesn't happen again? Not only is that great on an incumbent contract, because the rumors are going around, they hate the incumbent because X and X went wrong. Well, if that competitive analysis from the competition doesn't lead to, yes, but they fixed it, then I'm all great with them thinking that's what's going wrong on my program.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to my customer, remind them, hey, remember we solved this problem. It is no longer an issue. We will write about it in our past performance. Please also reference it in our CPARs,
Yeah.
chances are
So
you're going to get a satisfactory score anyway, but
real improvement, right?
exactly. Try to get that score boosted back up, especially if it is between, option year 2 or 3 got that satisfactory CPARs. You solve the problem. You need that CPARs to come up in those later option years to demonstrate that you've been performing in the way that you have, to kind of flip the script on the competition, as it were, as the incumbent.
At the end of the day, I think it's really important to remember, and it's easy to forget, that you're dealing with human beings on the other end of the RFP. These are people. They have families and lives just like you do, and they are susceptible to human foibles, and they are also susceptible to human psychology. So showing them the positives, being a little bit vulnerable. I'm not saying put it in bright lights, but like being a little bit vulnerable can mitigate the hits that your competitors can put on you by acknowledging it, and just remember that they're people, and write to them as though they are people and not some machine and analyzing this. Although that's probably down the pike a little bit.
It may be, but as we preach, there will be a person there eventually looking at that proposal. And you're exactly right, Steve. We're all people. We're all very busy. We're all trying to do our very best. But what I'm an advocate for, and every one of these podcasts will probably have this same quote in there, is getting the right people to do the right thing at the right time. And capture intelligence is the right thing to do in competitive bidding. Gathering that intel and then getting it into the proposal. So my eyes go big here because that's a gap in our industry, is the intelligence coming out of the capture team into the proposal team. So let's talk how do we get our humans correlated in that, what I call that relay handoff from capture to proposals, carrying that baton. And then also from that information analysis piece, how does that information get into the proposal?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the thing that I have done in my career, when I was in a proposal manager role and now that I'm in a capture manager role, the key is to be engaged early on. There are resource constraints. You can't always have a capture manager and a proposal manager running side stream with each other, but having regular contact and tag ups early on in the capture process with who your proposal manager is going to be can really help mitigate that, because then they can, act as a, reminder. Hey, you said X 6 months ago or whatever. That can be really helpful because I forget things, you forget things, proposal forgets things. If you don't have that ability though, the key is recording, writing it down, and staying engaged from a capture perspective in the proposal process, because I have experienced capture managers of varying levels of engagement in the proposal process. I didn't get experienced capture managers who decided they were going to be the proposal manager. And I've experienced capture managers who disappear into the wind the second the proposal drops. So there's a middle ground there. And it's really important that you find that and that you work with your proposal manager. When we worked together back at GD, they had a graphic, and it stuck with me for 14 years. They had 2 lines. The top line was capture, the bottom line was proposal, and then there was a vertical line in the middle that represented RFP release. And at that point, the capture and proposal lines flip spots. Mm-hmm. Capture rode shotgun and proposal rode on top. And that's really stuck with me because I think that's a very simple but ideal way to do things. You have to stay engaged with the proposal, but you cannot try and run the proposal because you have a proposal manager who is the professional that is doing that. You have to be engaged and you have to put your input in a timely manner. Don't show up at Gold Team and be like, why is none of my stuff in here? Because you had 2 other reviews to do that, my friend. Right?
Right. Oh,
We've all
God.
been there from a proposal perspective. I'm sure I've done it to people from a capture perspective, but that's where I try and do better, is that integration and handoff. We just switched over on a strategic capture. Last week, we ended our capture calls and transitioned them to proposal calls. And because I've been running with it for a number of months, on the first proposal call yesterday, people were like, okay, so Steve, what, and I'm like, nope. This is hers to run now. You need to talk to her. And so making sure, and I'm trying to be very, very very intentional about that, because I had a boss at one point. I said, I want to go into proposals or into capture when I was in proposals. And she said, well, I found the capture managers who were proposal managers go one of two ways. They either are awful and try and get too deep into the proposal, or they're really good because they understand how the proposal is supposed to work and they support the proposal manager. So I tried very much to be the latter. I don't always succeed, but that kind of handoff and support is the answer to the question. How do you make sure that competitive intelligence gets in there? You look at it once it's in proposal, taking your hands off the reins and looking at the proposal from an evaluator's perspective and saying, how would I evaluate this, but also how would our competition, what's our competition going to say that is going to be a problem here, right? What have we not covered that our competition is going to cover?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And a step back and outside perspective is critical.
Absolutely. And as you talked about, having 3 reviews, if the company is following the color team system, even so, there are multiple opportunities for a capture manager to come in and validate that my capture is still well represented inside of this proposal. Gold team is not it. Pink team, that's where that comes in. Bullet it, mark it in there, get it in there, placeholder it, put in your action captions. That's where the rest of the proposal content, the actual solution, formulates itself around that competitive intelligence, and not the other way around where you're trying to squeeze those square pegs into the round holes of a win theme needs to be in this paragraph, a ghosting needs to be in this paragraph. No, start with the win theme. The win theme is probably a reflection of your competitive analysis to begin with, or your customer intel, one or the other, and then drive the conversation of the proposal using the intelligence of capture, and especially that competitive analysis. If you're going to spend the time and the resources to collect the data,
right,
use it in the proposal.
And that's why having a proposal manager engaged early on is critical, because I know that if I won the lottery and not hit by a car, I'm going to make this positive. If I won the lottery tomorrow and I disappeared, my proposal manager has the information that she needs to take this across the finish line with all the respective intelligence that they need to incorporate my capture vision into this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because we've been engaged on all of our capture calls for the last X months.
Yeah. That's why I found it so fascinating, Steve, when we started to say that, though both of us started almost at the exact same time doing a very similar job with the same leadership and mentorship, taking off in these different directions. Where I am is I want that capture information. I have suffered, and not me, Marcia Watson, but I'm going to talk about our colleagues and our peers and our friends who we just know that we're not getting what we need in order to be as successful as we can be for our employer company. And that's the other part I think that gets missed is we work not just to grow our business, but we work to grow the economy. We work to, we're not trying to put these competitors out of jobs. We're trying to boost them and make them more competitive and expand. I think, and I'm not going to stay on this topic for long, but I think going into the next administration, companies are going to find themselves maybe in a different line of work or not finding that comfort zone that they've always had in their environments. And they're going to go in that one-off over to this company or over to this client, or they're going to go in a different direction using what they already have. So we're not going to have a whole lot of familiarity, I don't think, going into 25, 26 of who's actually in this competitive landscape. I think there's going to be a lot of shifting and readjusting inside the small business and even some of the larges, refinding their footing based on how these changes take place.
Yeah. The dollars are going to go different places, right? If you're, I'm thumb in the wind going to say, if you're a USDA or an EPA contractor, it's going to be a very lean 4 years if you try and stay with that agency. That's alone. So you're going to take your assistant or advisory and assistant services expertise, and you're going to find another customer. So for me, if I'm looking at an ANAS bid in one of my customers that's not one of those agencies, like you said, I need to be prepared for new entrants to the market, because if I'm not, I'm going to get my lunch eaten.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those new entrants they're going to come in with innovation. They're going to come in with best practice that they learned from a different yet adaptable environment and assimilate themselves into this new agency. And there's going to be a lot of change. And actually, I'm kind of excited for some of it. Some things do need to be shifted around a little bit, change the status quo, absolutely. But let's not lose the fundamentals of how the best practice really does lead into that winning proposal. I'm going to hit one more topic, Steve, and then we're going to wrap up on time. So you mentioned earlier, we've been unfortunate. We've lost a bid. How do we use debrief information to glean competitive intelligence?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a really good question. I think there's a number of ways that you can do that. One thing that you're going to get in the debrief is your price, which you know, and the winning price, which you may not know. And that may be a 2% difference. It may be a 22% difference. And so we just had one that we were like, how did they get so low? And we backed into it. It turned out that the direct labor rates, what we assumed were correct on our side, had to have been wrong for them to be awarded at the price that they were awarded at, because it was a fixed level of effort that the customer provided. Like the spreadsheet was locked. You couldn't add a single hour. So things like that, getting an understanding of what, and so now we know that customer is willing to accept for a significant discount, potentially not as good personnel because they have awarded at that, right? So, and not to say that how much you're paying your people is a direct representation of how good they are, but when there's a delta like there was on this one, it was like a $6 million delta on a $50 million opportunity. Like it was pretty significant. Like that's not going to be the same quality of personnel that you're going to get that you would have gotten at the deal that we put out. Right. And I know that I'm talking a lot about losses, and that's throughout this podcast, but that's primarily because I learned so much more from the bad stories than the good stories. Right. And you should always get a debrief on a win as well, because you can learn from those. But from a loss perspective, you can often understand what rank you were, right? Were you the third best? Were you the second best? Were you almost there? How did your past performance stack up against their past performance from an adjectival rating? Technical approach as well. Oftentimes they'll give you, sometimes it's a one-page thing. Here you lost, here's the winning price. Sorry, try again next time. Sometimes they'll give you a really detailed piece of information. They'll give you a whole sheaf of letters. I don't think that I've ever actually seen them release the source selection decision, but God, I wish they would, because that would make everybody's life work easier. Right? NASA
is the only organization that I've ever seen that will actually release the commentary from the source selection board. But you're exactly right. Let's take that past performance example. So we theoretically use the same past performance reference every single time. We know this is our go-to past performance reference. However, if after 3 debriefs, we're finding ours is referenced satisfactory and others are referenced highly relevant, we need to reflect on ourselves with that. What is it about our past performance that isn't showing the customer what we wanted to show? Is the other are the other competitors' past performance that much greater, or is it just telling a different story?
Yeah. How well are you mapping to the requirements of the opportunity, right? If you're already aware that it's a somewhat relevant, but it is still irrelevant, but like a marginally relevant past performance, how can you tell that story better? And you can do that a number of different ways. You can have third-party reviewers come in and say, yeah, I don't see this. And just grab somebody else from a different part of your company, right? Like you may be at a small business with 10 people, grab the 10th guy who doesn't usually work on a proposal. They're still a human being. They still have a brain between their ears. They can still say, yeah, I don't see how that's relevant. It's as simple as just perspective, really. Getting a different one. If you find yourself in a situation where you are continuing to have that problem, then maybe you're kind of, like I said at the outset, drinking your own bathwater here. And you need a separate set of eyes, a different perspective on the work to get an understanding of how you can be better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought it full circle, tying it all back together and always keeping that human element as part of it. That's been a theme going through these podcasts this year. Is the human element. It's how we relate to each other and how we take the information that we glean from our jobs, our roles and responsibilities, and take it to the next degree and the next level at the next stage in the life cycle. And that's one of the things that I appreciate so much about you, Steve, is that, you have that big picture. You've been in proposals, you've gone up to capture. And so you have that relatable experience and understanding of what's true, what's needed, and what's good. So I appreciate you. And I appreciate that the leadership and the mentorship that you bring to our industry, especially with your work through APMP. So thank you so much, Steve. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up for today.
Thank you so much for having me, Marcia. It's been great. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work together here.
Likewise, absolutely. So just to close it up and wrap it up, incorporating the insights from today's episode into your capture process can significantly enhance your competitive edge. By ensuring competitive analysis is a continuous effort integrated throughout the buying cycle to maintain strategic awareness. Focus on gathering critical competitive intelligence, including technical capabilities, past performance, price strategies, leadership styles even, and unique discriminators. This intelligence can be used not only to inform your capture strategy, but to proactively shape and create opportunities before they reach the proposal stage. When crafting proposal responses, embed these insights into highlights in your strengths and strategically counter competitive weaknesses. By transforming competitive data into actionable strategies and taking a proactive approach, you can position your organization for success in this dynamic landscape. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining me today. This has been the Optimize Podcast with VisibleThread.
And that wraps up this episode of the Optimize Podcast. A big shout out to our amazing host, Marcia Watson, and our guest, Steve Skeldon. You can connect with Steve in the links in the description. Optimize is brought to you by VisibleThread, the RFP software for analyzing solicitations and contracts, and for creating and editing proposals. VisibleThread is used by 11 of the top 15 US government contractors. For more information, visit VisibleThread.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you are listening. Stay tuned for more insightful discussions on the Optimize Podcast.